The sun had just begun to sink below the jagged horizon, painting the Texas sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Dust swirled across the dry prairie like restless spirits, and the wind carried the faint whistle of a distant train.
Out there in.
The endless sweep of the desert, a lone figure sat atop his horse, silhouette sharp against the fading light. He was known across the county for his skill with a lasso and the cold precision with which he handled trouble. Folks called him Colt, a name that drew respect and a little fear, and tonight, he was restless in a way that even the long, empty roads could not soothe. He wasn't hunting cattle or tracking rustlers tonight. He was waiting for something that made his chest tighten in ways he hadn't felt in years. Colt had made his life on the open range, a life of sunburned skin and nights under the stars, a life where the only rules were his own. He had loved in fleeting moments, never deeper than the river bends he crossed at dusk. But now, at 33, he wanted something he had never sought before. Someone who would change him. Someone pure, untouched by the harshness of the world he had grown accustomed to. That's how he found himself at the small, weathered cabin of Lilith Hawk, a woman whose reputation for quiet strength had traveled faster than the prairie fire. She was young, strong-willed, and mysterious, a rare spirit who moved through the world with the kind of poise that commanded attention without demanding it. The first time Colt had laid eyes on her, she was stacking firewood with hands calloused from work yet delicate in their movements, and something in him had clicked. He'd seen enough women to know the difference between a fleeting fascination and the kind. A fire that could set a man's soul ablaze. Lilith Hawk had that fire. He didn't speak of it, not aloud, but in the silence between them, a challenge lingered, one that neither wanted to name, but both could feel. The invitation he had extended for her to come with him into marriage was a gamble, one fueled by the hope of claiming a life unmarred by the rough edges of his own. Colt had always believed he could handle anything, from a runaway stallion to a barroom brawl. At the thought of his wedding night, sent an unfamiliar shiver down his spine. Lilith, aware of the unspoken tension between them, had given him a look the day before that lingered in his memory. Her eyes were pools of steady confidence, and her smile was a tease, not cruel, but daring, as if she knew exactly what he feared before he did. She wasn't the kind of woman to be tamed, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to tame her, or if he even could. The wedding itself had been a small affair. The local preacher's words fell on ears half attentive, half distracted by the sight of Lilith standing at the altar with a quiet grace that made the whole congregation pause. Colt had felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a rhythm foreign to him in its insistence. When he finally took her hand, her grip firm and unwavering, he realized that every tale of wild love he had heard from old cowhands was nothing compared to the storm that stirred in his chest at that moment. By the time night fell, the cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth. Outside, coyotes sang their mournful chorus to the moon, and the wind rustled the dry grass like whispered secrets. Inside, Colt and Lilith stood facing one another, a lifetime of expectation pressing down on them in the hush. He had imagined this moment countless times, each vision carefully rehearsed in his mind. Yet none of them could prepare him for the electricity in the air, the tangible tension that seemed to wrap the room like a second skin. Lilith's expression was unreadable, yet every movement of her shoulders, every tilt of her head, spoke of the control she wielded so effortlessly. Colt swallowed hard, realizing that the life he had imagined of simple union, of easy passion, was not what awaited him here. Lilith had her own rules, her own rhythm, and she intended to guide the first night on her terms. That knowledge struck him with a weight he hadn't anticipated. He had wanted a virgin bride, thinking it would mean simplicity, innocence, a life untraveled by hearts other than his own. What he hadn't foreseen was that innocence carried its own power, quiet command that could stop a man in his tracks, leave him blinking in wonder. Questioning the depth of his own courage, the firelight danced across the wooden walls, casting elongated shadows that seemed to mirror his inner turmoil. Colt's fingers itched, not with impatience, but with the strange mixture of awe and fear that only a force as unpredictable as Lilith could summon. He had faced storms, gunfights, and nights without food, yet nothing had prepared him for this. Lilith stepped closer, her boots soft against the floorboards, her presence like a melody he had never learned but instinctively recognized. She didn't speak immediately. Words were unnecessary when the language between them had already been spoken in glances and gestures. He realized then that this was not a moment he could dominate with strength or experience. This was a night where patience, respect, and understanding of the delicate balance between fear and desire would decide the course of their bond. His jaw tightened, his mind racing with the rules he had always believed in, now colliding with the reality that Lilith had her own set of expectations that he would have to meet or falter before her. He could feel his heartbeat, loud and insistent, as if echoing the pulse of the desert outside. Lilith reached for him, not with desperation, but with the assurance of someone who knew precisely what she sought. Colt froze, caught in the current of anticipation that neither of them tried to temper. The air seemed to thicken, carrying the scent of pine smoke and wild sage, the very essence of the untamed land they both called home. And in that suspended moment, Colt understood the truth of the challenge he had undertaken. He was no longer the master of his own desire. Tonight, Lilith held the reins, and he would have to follow or risk losing himself in the weight of the unknown. The cabin door creaked as if to punctuate the silence, and outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant clatter of hooves from some ranch miles away. Colt's breath caught in his throat, not from the cold, but from the realization that everything he had believed about himself, about love, and about control was about to be tested. Lilith's eyes met his, unflinching and resolute, and he knew he could not turn back. He had crossed the threshold. There was no going back to the carefree life of a wandering cowboy. For a moment, time seemed to halt. The crackling fire was the only sound, the only witness to the tension coiling between them. Colt wanted to speak, to assure himself that he was ready, that he could face this, but the words stuck in his throat. He had never been frozen by fear before, yet here he was, paralyzed by the intensity of what lay ahead. Lilith's hand lingered near his chest, her warmth brushing against him, a reminder that he was no longer the hunter alone in the wild. He was a man standing on the edge of something vast, a landscape of emotion and desire he had only glimpsed in the dreams he dared not share. And then, as if the universe itself held its breath, Lilith took the first step forward. Colt's heart thumped in wild protest, yet he could not retreat. He was a cowboy hardened by life's trials, yet in this quiet cabin, under the watchful stars, he realized that the greatest challenge he had ever faced was not out on the prairie, but here, in the space between them. The first night promised to reveal more than either of them had imagined, and Colt understood that his life, his very understanding of himself, hung on the choices of this one woman. The fire crackled again, shadows dancing across Colt's face, highlighting the uncertainty in his eyes. Lilith's gaze never wavered, steady and unyielding, a mirror to the resolve that had drawn him across counties and deserts to this very moment. Colt felt the tension surge, a mixture of anticipation, reverence, and the dawning realization that tonight would mark the beginning of a bond neither could predict, a bond that would test every belief he had about strength, love, and surrender. He swallowed the taste of smoke and fear and something far sweeter mingling on his tongue, and waited, knowing that the first move was hers. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the promise of trials yet to come, and inside, Colt stood frozen, caught in the gravity of Lilith Hawke's presence, aware that whatever happened next would change him forever. The night stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, and the cowboy who had tamed rivers and wild stallions found himself facing the one thing he could not control, a woman's will, unbroken and as fierce as the Texas sky. The first night was only beginning, and Colt's world was already trembling. Colt's mind raced as he watched Lilith move across the cabin, her every step deliberate, as if she were marking the ground with silent authority. He tried to steady his breathing, tried to remind himself that he had faced dangers far greater than the uncertainty of this night, yet there was something different in the air. This was not a fight to be won with skill or courage, but a challenge of patience, of understanding, of surrender. He had come to claim a life he thought he could shape, but Lilith Hawk was already shaping him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As she approached the window, pulling back the thin curtain to let the moonlight spill in, Colt caught a glimpse of her expression. It was calm, almost serene, yet there was a spark of mischief behind her eyes that made his pulse skip. He remembered the tales he had heard as a boy, stories of women who could command a man's attention with a glance, who could turn desire into reverence with nothing more than their presence. Lilith was that woman. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, steady and unwavering. And he knew he had no choice but to follow her lead. His thoughts drifted back to the journey that had brought them here. Colt had grown up in the shadow of his father's ranch, learning early that the world was a place that demanded toughness. He had wrestled steers, broken horses, and fought men who thought they could push him around, and he had never known hesitation. Yet all those experiences felt distant now, like echoes from another life. The woman before him represented something he had never truly confronted, a force of nature that could challenge his assumptions. A spirit unafraid to push boundaries he had long believed unassailable. Lilith turned from the window, her dark hair catching the moonlight, and Colt noticed for the first time the small scars along her forearms. Faint reminders of a life shaped by labor and hardship. She had not come from privilege. She had carved her existence from the harsh soil of the prairie, shaping herself into someone capable of surviving alone. That knowledge both intimidated and fascinated him. He had always been drawn to strength, yet he had never met it in a form so refined, so deliberate. She was a mystery he had no choice but to unravel. The first night promised to be the beginning of that journey. Colt's gaze drifted to the cabin's hearth, where the fire flickered and hissed. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching in ways that seemed almost alive, as if they were playing out the tension that filled the room. He remembered the stories of men who had fallen for women like Lilith, men who had been unprepared for the depth of passion and intellect these women possessed. He had thought he was ready, thought his life of independence had prepared him, but now he felt the first pricklings of doubt. The fear wasn't of Lilith herself, but of the unknown, of the emotions and desires he could not yet name, of the surrender he might have to offer to truly meet her. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the cabin's shutters with a ghostly insistence. Colt imagined the vast prairie beyond, the horizon stretched wide and endless, and he wondered if Lilith's spirit was as boundless as the land she had grown up on. She had moved through life with a confidence that had been honed by solitude and struggle, and he could see how the world had tried and failed to bend her. He had thought marriage was a simple union, a way to claim a life unmarred by hardship. He had been wrong. Lilith was not someone to be claimed. She was someone to be met. Someone whose presence demanded respect and careful attention. He remembered the conversation they had shared earlier that evening, quiet words spoken over supper by lamplight. She had asked him questions that caught him off guard, questions about his fears, his ambitions, his understanding of what love could mean. He had answered with the honesty of a man used to facing danger, but unpracticed in facing vulnerability. She had listened, and in the way she had nodded. In the soft tilt of her head, Colt realized that she was weighing him, assessing him not for the man he had been, but for the man he could become. Lilith moved toward the hearth, crouching slightly to tend the fire. Colt noticed the precision in her movements, the way she handled the logs, as if every action carried weight. He was captivated not just by her beauty, but by the competence she displayed, the quiet authority that came from living fully in her own skin. It was a power that he could neither ignore nor challenge, a force that demanded his attention and respect. The cabin, small and intimate, felt like a stage for the unspoken drama between them, and Colt could sense that the night ahead would test not just his desires, but his very understanding of himself. He thought of the prairie, of the long rides he had taken alone under the sun, of the nights spent listening to the wind and the distant calls of coyotes. Those nights had been solitary, filled with freedom, but also emptiness. Now, standing in the warmth of the cabin with Lilith, he realized that freedom alone had never been enough. What he wanted, what he needed, was connection. A bond forged in the quiet understanding between two people who respected and challenged each other in equal measure. And for the first time, he understood that such a bond required humility, patience, and the willingness to be vulnerable, a lesson he had yet to fully learn. Lilith finally stood, moving toward him with deliberate steps. Colt could feel the air shift, heavy with anticipation. Her presence was commanding, yet there was a softness in her eyes that suggested trust and openness. He realized that everything he had imagined about this night, the control, the experience, the assumptions, was irrelevant. What mattered was presence, attention, and the willingness to meet her where she was. Without pretense or expectation, he tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Words felt clumsy, inadequate in the face of what Lilith represented. She didn't rush him, didn't offer reassurances, but the quiet strength she exuded seemed to guide him nonetheless. Colt could feel the pull between them, a tension that was equal parts fear and fascination, a challenge that would not be solved with bravado or experience. He understood, with a clarity that startled him, that this was not a test he could pass by force. It required trust, patience, and surrender to the unknown. The fire crackled again, casting shadows that danced across their faces. Colt's thoughts flickered to the years he had spent mastering his own life, mastering horses and guns, mastering the terrain of the prairie. None of it had prepared him for this Taranta landscape of human emotion, of desire tempered by respect, of power shared rather than seized. He realized that Lilith Hawk was teaching him something he had never learned before, something far more difficult than breaking a wild horse or facing down an outlaw. She was teaching him patience, attentiveness, and the courage to surrender to the strength of another. Colt glanced toward the window, imagining the moon hanging high above the prairie, the vastness of the land reflecting the vastness of the challenge before him. He knew that the first night was only the beginning, that the bond he sought would not be formed in hours or days, but in the careful negotiation of trust, respect, and shared desire. He felt a shiver run through him, not of fear, but of anticipation. Every instinct told him to act, to take control, but he knew instinct alone was insufficient here. Lilith was not a woman to be tamed or dominated. She was a force to be understood, and Colt would need every ounce of patience he could summon. The wind outside whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of sage and earth, and Colt realized how far he had come. From the lone rides under the open sky to this intimate cabin, where the real test of his character awaited, Lilith's eyes met his again, steady and unwavering, and he felt the gravity of her presence pull him forward. He understood that the first night would set the tone for everything to come. And yet he also knew that the outcome was uncertain. The path ahead was uncharted, a frontier as wild and untamed as the prairie itself. And he could only move forward with care, courage, and the willingness to learn from the woman who had so completely captivated him. Colt took a slow breath, letting the tension ease slightly but not disappear. The firelight flickered, illuminating the lines of his face, the uncertainty in his eyes, and the unspoken promise of the night ahead. Lilith moved again, closer this time, and the world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the cabin, the fire, and the charged space between them. Colt felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and a dawning respect for the power and wisdom of the woman before him. He understood, in that suspended moment, that nothing would be simple tonight. The first night promised revelations, not just of desire, but of character, of limits, of courage, and of the bonds that could form when two strong wills met in equal measure. Colt's hand itched to reach for her, yet he restrained himself, knowing that the greatest challenge was not to act, but to listen, to observe, to be present. Lilith Hawk was a force he could not command, and in that, knowledge lay the beginning of a lesson that would change him forever. The cabin was silent, except for the fire and the wind outside, and Colt realized that the night was stretching ahead, full of possibilities and tests yet to come. He felt the weight of the unknown pressing on him, yet he also felt a thrill he had never known, a sense that life was about to teach him something he could not have learned in solitude or freedom alone. He was a cowboy, hardened by years of survival and solitude, yet here in the quiet of the cabin with Lilith, he faced a challenge greater than any he had encountered on the prairie. The night was young, the fire warm, and Lilith's gaze unwavering. Colt knew that the story of their lives had only just begun, and the first night would be the spark that ignited a journey neither of them could yet predict. Colt sat on the edge of the bed, the rough wool of the blanket scratching against his thighs, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. He had faced storms, barroom fights, and cattle stampedes. Yet none of it had prepared him for the quiet intensity of Lilith Hawke's presence. She stood near the window, the moonlight painting her in silver and shadow, a figure both inviting and formidable. Colt felt a tension coil in his chest, a mix of anticipation and fear, the kind that whispered warnings he could not ignore. He had imagined this night countless times, each vision carefully rehearsed in his mind, yet none of it matched the reality. Lilith's power wasn't loud or forceful. It was still, deliberate, and completely unyielding. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall prairie grass, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. The cabin creaked in response to the shifting night, small sounds that seemed exaggerated in the charged quiet between them. Colt's gaze kept drifting to the fire, its amber glow dancing across the wooden walls. But he could not take his eyes from Lilith. Her movements were measured, her expression calm, yet impossible to read. He realized, with a start, that this was not a moment he could control with strength or experience. The power she carried was subtle, but absolute. The realization hit him harder than any gunshot or runaway steer ever had. Colt's thoughts wandered to the life he had left behind in the open prairie. He had always been a man of action, used to solving problems with skill and force. But Lilith had introduced a kind of challenge he had never faced before, one of patience, intuition, and understanding. The first night was not about domination or conquest. It was about connection. A delicate balance that required him to meet her on her terms, rather than imposing his own. He felt a shiver run down his spine, part fear, part admiration, as he realized how little he truly understood about her, and how much he wanted to. Lilith finally spoke, her voice soft but commanding. Cutting through the silence like the whisper of wind through a canyon, she asked him questions, not ones meant to tease, but questions that weighed him, measured him, examined him. What did he value? What did he fear? What did he hope to become? Colt tried to answer honestly, but every word seemed inadequate, clumsy in the presence of her quiet authority. She did not push, did not judge. She simply observed, listening with a patience that made him feel simultaneously exposed and safe, as he answered. Colt became aware of a subtle rhythm to their interaction, a give and take that mirrored the landscape outside. The prairie could be both forgiving and unforgiving, full of open space, yet filled with hidden dangers. Lilith seemed to embody that same duality, strength tempered by thoughtfulness, beauty sharpened by resilience. Colt realized that their union was not simply about desire, it was about learning to navigate one another, to respect and understand, to find a balance between two powerful wills. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the room, and Colt felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He thought of his father's ranch, the endless work of wrangling cattle, building fences, surviving the harsh Texas sun. That life had taught him endurance, skill, and self-reliance, but it had not prepared him for the vulnerability he now faced. Lilith had grown up on the same land, but her lessons had been different. She had learned to command respect without demanding it, to move through the world with precision and quiet strength. The contrast between their upbringings was stark, yet Colt felt it binding them in a way he couldn't explain. He glanced at Lilith again and noticed the faint lines of worry around her eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders. Despite her calm exterior, he sensed her own struggle, the effort to gauge him, to trust him enough to reveal the depth of her strength. For the first time, Colt understood that Lilith's power was not just in her presence, but in the choices she made, the control she exercised, and the patience with which she wielded it. He felt a strange mixture of respect, awe, and fear, all tangled together, as he realized that the first night was a test not of skill, But of character, Colt shifted in his seat, suddenly aware of how small the cabin felt, how the firelight seemed to illuminate not just the room, but the invisible tension between them. His mind raced with memories of past encounters, of women he had thought he loved, fleeting passions that had never demanded his full attention. None of those experiences mattered here. Lilith was different. She required more than instinct or desire. She required engagement, focus, and the willingness to face the unknown within himself. Lilith moved closer to the bed, the movement fluid and deliberate. Colt could feel the energy in the room change, a subtle current that pulled him forward even as fear rooted him in place. Her presence was magnetic, yet it carried a weight that could not be ignored. He realized that the first night would not be measured in hours or gestures alone, but in understanding, in attention, in the small ways they learned each other's limits and boundaries. It was a negotiation, silent yet profound, one that would define the nature of their bond for years to come. The wind outside intensified, rattling the shutters and carrying the distant howl of a coyote. Colt's thoughts drifted again, this time to the subplots of their lives. He remembered the whispers from the town rumors of his father's past, of rival ranchers who had tried and failed to claim what Colt had inherited. He thought of the debts, the cattle rustling, the long nights keeping watch over the herd. Those struggles had defined him, forged him into a man of endurance and skill. Lilith's past, though less visible, seemed equally complex. He could sense the burdens she carried, the resilience she had cultivated in solitude, the careful way she navigated a world often hostile to women like her. Together, they were a collision of legacies, each shaping the other even before the first night had truly begun. Colt tried to speak, to bridge the gap between anticipation and action, but his voice faltered. Words seemed inadequate, tripping over themselves in the presence of Lilith's composed intensity. She noticed, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips, not mocking, but understanding. She had seen hesitation before, though never like this. He was a man used to controlling every situation. Yet here he was, confronted with a challenge that could not be overcome with skill alone. The realization settled over him like a weight, yet it was not crushing, it was invigorating. He wanted to rise to it, to meet her, to understand the full measure of what Lilith Hawk could command. He recalled the early days of their courtship, how he had been drawn to her strength, her intellect, her quiet confidence. The simplicity of a small-town wedding had given way to a complexity. He had not anticipated the first night would not be a simple culmination of desire, but a test of patience, attention, and mutual understanding. Colt's heart pounded as he considered the stakes, knowing that every action, every hesitation, every choice would ripple outward, shaping the nature of their relationship in ways he could not yet predict. The fire sputtered, sending sparks into the air, and Colt felt the heat brush against his skin, a reminder of the tangible reality amidst the abstract tension. Lilith adjusted the blankets, her movements precise, almost ritualistic, and he realized that every gesture carried meaning. This was not simply a private moment between husband and wife. It was the beginning of a negotiation of wills, a careful balance of power and trust. Colt understood that he would need to shed his assumptions to approach the night with humility, and to allow her strength to guide them both. Lilith's gaze held his, unflinching and steady, and Colt felt a wave of emotion crash over him. He wanted to act, to take control, yet he knew that control here was meaningless. The challenge was to follow, to learn, to engage with her on equal footing. He felt the old cowboy instincts of independence and self-reliance collide with something new, the recognition that vulnerability could be a form of strength, that surrender could be courageous, and that connection demanded patience as much as passion. Colt's thoughts wandered to the future, to the life they could build together if he rose to the challenge. He imagined long rides across the prairie, evenings by the fire, and mornings in the cabin with Lilith by his side. But the reality of the night pressed in, demanding focus, demanding respect. The first night was not a promise of comfort. It was an initiation, a test of character that would reveal both their strengths and their fears. Colt knew he had to meet it fully awake, fully present, and fully honest. Outside, The wind carried the scent of distant rain, the promise of storms on the horizon. Inside, Colt and Lilith stood at the threshold of a challenge neither could yet predict. He felt his pulse quicken, a mixture of fear and anticipation, as he realized that the night was far from over. Every instinct, every memory, every lesson from the prairie would be tested in the space between them. And he understood that he could not rely on experience alone. The first night demanded more: attention, understanding, and the courage to face the unknown. Colt swallowed hard, the firelight reflecting in his eyes, and took a slow, deliberate breath. Lilith's gaze held him, steady and unwavering, and he felt the weight of her presence press against him. He realized that the night would unfold according to her terms, that he must follow rather than lead, and that every hesitation or misstep could alter the course of their bond. He felt fear, yes, but also excitement, the thrill of meeting someone whose strength challenged him in ways he had never imagined. The wind whispered through the prairie, carrying the distant howl of coyotes and the scent of sage, and Colt understood that the first night was only the beginning. The true test lay ahead, in the quiet negotiation of trust, respect, and understanding between two powerful wills. Lilith Hawk had stepped into his life like a force of nature, and he knew that meeting her fully required surrender, patience, and courage. The night stretched before them, full of tension, possibility, and the promise of revelations yet to come. Colt's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, and he felt the pulse of the fire echo the pulse of his own anticipation. He understood that he had crossed a threshold, that the story of their lives was unfolding in ways neither could fully control, and that the first night would define the landscape of their bond. The prairie outside was vast and untamed, yet the space between them held its own kind of wilderness, one he would have to navigate with care, respect, and the willingness to face the unknown. The cabin fell silent again, save for the fire and the wind, and Colt felt the weight of anticipation pressing on him. Lilith stood close, a figure of calm power, and he realized that everything he had imagined about the first night was insufficient. The challenges ahead were not simply physical or emotional. They were a test of character, of understanding, and of the courage to meet another human being fully. The night was young, the stakes high, and the tension between them palpable, a living, breathing presence that demanded attention and respect. The fire in the cabin had burned low, leaving only glowing embers that cast flickering shadows across the walls. Colt's hands rested on his knees, but his fingers twitched with a restless energy he could not shake. He had faced countless challenges on the prairie storms that threatened to sweep him off his horse, cattle stampedes that tested every ounce of his reflexes, men who had come at him with guns drawn but nothing, had unsettled him like the quiet intensity of Lilith Hawk. She had not raised her voice or demanded anything of him, yet the tension in the room felt heavier than any storm he had weathered. He understood now that the first night was only the beginning, that the true test lay in the delicate balance of trust and understanding they were still learning to navigate. Lilith sat near the hearth, her dark hair falling over her shoulders in a cascade that caught the ember glow. She picked up a small log, weighing it in her hands before placing it carefully back in the fire. Every movement she made was precise, deliberate, as if she were measuring the atmosphere around them. Colt's heart pounded, each beat echoing the rhythm of anticipation that had settled over the cabin. He wanted to speak, to fill the silence, yet he knew that words could not capture the tension, the gravity of the unspoken challenge between them. The wind outside rattled the shutters, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and distant rain. Colt remembered his early days on the ranch, the endless rides across the prairie under an open sky, the nights spent listening to the coyotes' chorus. Those nights had taught him endurance, observation, and the quiet patience required to survive in a harsh land. Yet all of those lessons felt inadequate in the face of Lilith Hawk. She had her own kind of strength, one cultivated not in solitude, but in the careful navigation of a world that had never yielded easily to her. Colt realized that to meet her, he would need more than skill or experience. He would need insight, humility, and the courage to face himself. Lilith finally spoke, her voice a calm anchor in the charged silence. She asked Colt about the life he envisioned with her, not the dreams he had chased as a lone cowboy, but the life they could forge together. Her questions were simple yet incisive, cutting through the bravado he had carried for years. Colt struggled to answer, feeling his usual confidence falter under the weight of her scrutiny. She did not mock him, but her steady gaze made him feel exposed in ways he had never known. The fire crackled, filling the room with its warmth. Yet Colt felt a chill in the pit of his stomach. The realization that this night was not about desire alone, it was about understanding. About navigating the unknown together. He remembered the whispers from the small towns they had passed through on the way to this cabin. Rumors of his father's past, of rival ranchers who had tried to claim his land, of threats that had stalked him in the night. Colt had faced those dangers head-on, and yet none of them compared to the tension building here. Lilith was not a threat in the usual sense. She was a force of her own making, a test of character and courage that no man could face without reckoning. He felt both fear and fascination, tangled mix that left him restless and alert. Lilith moved closer to the bed, her steps silent against the worn wooden floor. Colt's pulse quickened, not in anticipation of action, but in recognition of the weight her presence carried. She was not inviting him forward, nor was she retreating. She was holding her own space, challenging him to meet her fully awake, fully present. He wanted to act, to take control, but he realized that control here was meaningless. The first night demanded observation, patience, and engagement on equal footing. He understood that any misstep, any assumption, could alter the delicate balance they were building. The shadows from the fire danced across their faces, highlighting the intensity of the moment. Colt's mind drifted to the past, to his own mistakes and misjudgments, to the fleeting relationships that had left him empty despite all his bravado. He had always believed that strength came from independence, from the ability to face danger alone. Lilith was teaching him something different, that true strength could be shared, that vulnerability could be courageous. And that understanding another human being fully was as challenging as any storm or stampede he had encountered. Outside, the prairie seemed to hold its breath, the wind shifting as if aware of the tension inside the cabin. Colt noticed the subtle lines of determination on Lilith's face, the way she measured each action, each pause, with precision. She was testing him as much as he was testing himself, probing his patience and his ability to meet her strength with equal measure. The thought sent a thrill through him, a mixture of fear and excitement, as he realized that this night was not about resolution, but about confrontation with each other, with themselves. And with the limits of the lives they had lived separately, Colt's hands itched to reach for her, to bridge the distance that seemed charged with invisible energy, yet he held himself back. He understood that the first night was a negotiation, a silent dance where patience and awareness mattered more than instinct or desire. Lilith's power lay not in command, but in her ability to challenge him subtly, to make him confront his own assumptions and insecurities. He felt the weight of the lesson pressing on him, a quiet insistence that he meet the moment with honesty and courage. The fire sputtered, sending sparks into the air, and Colt could feel the tension coiling tighter in his chest. His mind wandered to the future, to the life they could build together if he rose to this challenge. He imagined long rides across the prairie, evenings spent by the fire, mornings in the cabin with Lilith. But the reality of the night pressed in with full force. The challenges ahead were immediate, intense, and unforgiving. Every glance, every hesitation, every unspoken word mattered. Shaping the course of their bond before it had fully formed, Lilith's gaze held him, unwavering and calm, and Colt felt the stirrings of a deep, unfamiliar respect. He wanted to act, to take the lead as he had done so many times in his life, but he realized that leadership here was irrelevant. The first night demanded more than skill or courage. It demanded insight, patience, and a willingness to surrender to the unpredictable force of another person. Colt's mind raced with questions he had never considered. Could he meet her strength without fear? Could he honor her presence without overstepping? Could he face the vulnerability she demanded without faltering? Outside, the wind shifted again, rattling the cabin and carrying the scent of distant rain. The prairie, with its endless horizon and hidden dangers, mirrored the uncharted terrain between them. Colt felt a shiver run through him, not from cold, but from the realization that the night was testing him in ways no cattle stampede or gunfight ever could. Lilith Hawk was teaching him, guiding him, challenging him to face both himself and her fully. The tension was unbearable, yet exhilarating. A storm of anticipation that left him simultaneously terrified and alive. He remembered the journey that had brought them here. The long ride across counties, the quiet understanding that had grown between them, and the way Lilith had tested him even before marriage. Every encounter, every word, every glance had been a preparation for this night. Yet nothing had fully equipped him for the intensity of their connection. Colt felt the weight of his own expectations pressing down, clashing with the reality of her presence. He had imagined conquest, but now he understood that the first night was a revelation, a test of patience, character, and mutual respect. Lilith stepped closer, the firelight catching the determination in her eyes. Colt's heart raced, and he felt the tension in the room rise to an almost unbearable level. The space between them was charged, a living current that demanded attention, focus, and careful navigation. Every instinct in Colt screamed to act, to claim control, yet he held himself back, aware that the balance of power rested not in his hands but in the silent negotiation unfolding before him. He thought of the life he wanted, the partnership he hoped to build, and the strength he would need to rise to the challenge. The prairie had taught him endurance, skill, and survival. But Lilith Hawk was teaching him lessons far more subtle and profound: the strength of patience, the power of observation, and the courage to surrender to trust. Colt understood that the climax of this night would not be decided in action alone, but in the ability to navigate the tension, the fear, and the anticipation that filled every corner of the cabin. The fire flickered one last time, casting elongated shadows across the room. Colt's pulse echoed in his ears, and the wind outside whispered against the walls. He realized that the night had reached its most intense moment, the point where anticipation teetered on the edge of revelation. Lilith's gaze met his, steady and unwavering, and Colt understood that every choice from here on would shape not just the first night, but the course of their lives together. The tension was unbearable, yet electric. A storm of emotions waiting to break. Colt swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of the uncharted territory before him. The first night, the challenges, and the subtle tests of trust and understanding had all led to this charged moment. The cabin was alive with anticipation, with unspoken possibilities, and with the promise that the bond between them would be tested to its fullest. Every breath, every movement, every glance held meaning. And Colt understood that the climax of this night, the moment that would decide their future, was approaching with unstoppable inevitability. The fire crackled softly as Colt and Lilith stood facing each other, the room suspended in a delicate tension. Every instinct, every memory, every lesson from the prairie and from life itself had led him here, to the precipice of understanding, desire, and trust. He could feel the electricity in the air, a storm of emotions and anticipation, and he knew that the resolution, the moment of connection and revelation, was just beyond reach. Colt's heart hammered, his thoughts raced, and yet he held still, aware that the night's most intense moments were unfolding in the silent negotiation between two powerful wills. Outside, the prairie waited, vast and untamed, while inside, Colt Hawk and Lilith Hawk stood on the edge of a revelation that could change everything. The climax was near, and the tension was unbearable. Every heartbeat, every glance, every pause was loaded with meaning. Colt knew that he was on the brink of a discovery, a transformation, and a union that would demand everything he had learned, everything he had yet to understand, and every ounce of courage he could summon. The night hung poised, electric and alive, a storm waiting to break. Colt Hawk's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths as he stood frozen, the tension of the past hours hanging in the cabin like the thick smoke of a spent fire. Lilith Hawk's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. a quiet command that told him he had finally arrived at the edge of the moment he had both feared and longed for. The weight of anticipation had not diminished. It had only sharpened, pressing him to confront everything he was, everything he had believed about himself, and everything he wanted in the life he hoped to build with her. Lilith took a slow step forward, closing the space between them, her gaze never leaving his. Colt felt the electricity in the air hum through him. But there was no panic this time, only the sharp clarity that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The hours of uncertainty, the struggle to meet her strength without faltering, had brought him here not to victory or conquest, but to understanding. He realized that the night had never been about control, but about presence, attentiveness, and the courage to meet another human being fully. The fire had burned down to embers, yet the warmth in the room had not waned. Colt's hands, which had trembled moments before, now rested lightly at his sides. Lilith reached out, not demanding, not guiding, but simply offering the quiet assurance that he had been waiting for. He took a step forward, and then another, until their hands met, fingers interlocking with the ease of familiarity that had grown between them in the brief hours since their marriage had begun. It was not a sudden leap into passion or conquest, but a careful, deliberate connection, a merging of trust, courage, and respect that neither could have forced but both could now claim. For Colt, it was a revelation. All the years he had spent mastering the land, the cattle, and even the men who had sought to challenge him had prepared him in ways he'd never expected, not for dominance, but for partnership. Lilith Hawk, with her quiet authority and unyielding strength, had taught him that true courage came from vulnerability, that power was not always about force, and that trust could be more binding than the strongest rope or the sharpest gun. Every hesitation, every question, every fear had led him to this moment, and he understood that the first night, which had loomed like an impossible test, was now a bridge to something greater, a life built on mutual respect, love, and understanding. Lilith's lips curved into a soft smile, the tension in her features melting into warmth. Colt felt his own body relax, the rigid lines of fear and uncertainty giving way to a steady confidence he had not known he possessed. They moved together without haste, each step careful and deliberate, a silent conversation that spoke louder than words. In that movement, Colt realized the essence of their bond, a partnership forged not in submission or dominance, but in equality, in trust, and in the willingness to honor one another's strength. Outside, the wind carried the gentle whisper of the prairie, the distant calls of coyotes replaced by the steady hush of night. Colt imagined the wide-open land beyond the cabin, the same land that had tested him for years, and he understood that the challenges of life were not only out there, in the open spaces, but also within the quiet intimacy of human connection. Lilith Hawk had shown him that strength could take many forms, and that the deepest victories were not measured in force or skill, but in understanding, patience, and love. Ours passed in silence. Yet it was a silence filled with meaning. Each glance, each gesture, each pause had become a thread weaving them together, stronger than any words could convey. Colt reflected on the journey that had brought them here, from the small towns and whispering neighbors to the long ride across the prairie, to the cabin that now felt like a sanctuary. Every moment of doubt and fear had sharpened his awareness. Every hesitation had taught him humility, and every question had led him closer to understanding the woman who had now claimed not just his hand, but his respect and admiration. As the fire dwindled further, casting soft golden light across their faces, Colt felt a profound sense of peace. The lessons of the night had been exacting, but they were also deeply rewarding. Lilith Hawk had not been an obstacle or a challenge to conquer. She had been a guide, a mirror, and a partner. He understood now that desire and love were not about control or possession, but about presence, attention, and the courage to meet one another fully. The first night had been a crucible, forging a bond stronger than either had imagined possible, and Colt knew that they had emerged from it changed, united in ways that extended far beyond the walls of the cabin. Colt's thoughts turned to the future, to the life they would build together on the ranch and beyond. He imagined mornings spent riding across the prairie with Lilith at his side, evenings filled with the quiet contentment of shared work and laughter, and nights warmed by the fire and the bond they had forged. He realized that the challenges would not end with this night. Life on the prairie was always unpredictable, but now he felt equipped. Not just with skill or courage, but with trust, respect, and the knowledge that Lilith Hawk would stand beside him. A partner in every sense, Lilith reached up, brushing a strand of hair from Colt's face. And he felt the weight of every unspoken word, every doubt, every question dissolve in the quiet warmth of her touch. It was a moment of clarity, of shared understanding. A quiet acknowledgement that the trials of the night had not divided them, but had drawn them closer together. Colt realized that the fear he had carried, the hesitation, and the uncertainty were not failures. They had been essential steps in discovering the depth of their connection, the true measure of strength and partnership between them. The cabin door creaked as the wind shifted outside, but neither Colt nor Lilith flinched. The world beyond the cabin could wait. In that space, they had discovered something enduring, a bond that could weather storms, outlast hardship, and thrive in the vast, unpredictable prairie of life. Colt felt a sense of pride and humility all at once, knowing that the man who had faced countless dangers now understood that the greatest challenge and the greatest reward lay in trust, patience, and love. They settled near the embers of the fire, the warmth mingling with the quiet contentment that had replaced the tension of earlier hours. Colt took Lilith's hand in his, the simple act carrying more weight than any gesture of dominance could have conveyed. He felt the pulse of connection, the steady heartbeat of partnership, and the quiet thrill of knowing that they had met the challenge of the night together. Every lesson, every hesitation, every moment of anticipation had led to this a partnership defined not by fear or control, but by courage, respect, and love. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and endless, the moon casting a silver glow across the land. Colt imagined the horizon they would ride toward together, open spaces waiting for their footsteps, the ranch they would nurture, and the life they would build. Inside the cabin, they had faced their own frontier, a landscape of vulnerability and trust, and emerged stronger for it. Colt knew that the path ahead would still hold challenges, but the foundation they had built tonight was unshakable. Anchored in mutual understanding and unwavering respect, Lilith leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, and Colt felt a sense of completion he had never known. Not the end of a journey, but the beginning of a partnership forged in the fires of patience, courage, and shared strength. He realized that the true victory of the night had not been in the resolution of desire, but in the affirmation of trust, the acknowledgement of strength, and the quiet joy of meeting another human being fully and honestly as the embers glowed faintly, and the wind whispered through the prairie grass. Colt Hawk understood the profound truth that had defined their first night. Life was unpredictable, the prairie vast and untamed, and the future uncertain, but together they had discovered a partnership capable of facing any storm, navigating any challenge, and thriving in the endless expanse of possibility. Lilith Hawk was not only his wife, but his equal, his partner, and the keeper of his strength that complemented his own. He held her close, feeling the quiet rhythm of her breath, and Colt knew that the journey ahead would be filled with challenges, triumphs, and moments that demanded courage and patience. But for the first time, he felt fully ready, not because he had mastered the land, or the cattle, or any danger, but because he had learned to meet another human being with honesty, respect, and unwavering presence. The first night had been the crucible, and now they had emerged united, stronger, and infinitely more connected than either could have imagined. The prairie outside remained vast, quiet, and alive under the moonlight. But inside the cabin, a new kind of peace settled. Colt Hawk and Lilith Hawk had faced the unspoken fears, the anticipation, and the tension of their first night, and emerged with a bond forged in patience, respect, and trust. The world would wait, the challenges would come, but tonight marked the beginning of a life together, one built on understanding, courage, and the quiet power of love that could endure any storm. In the warmth of the cabin, Colt felt the weight of the night lift, replaced by a profound sense of hope. The lessons of the prairie, the trials of life, and the uncertainty of the unknown had all led him to this moment. Lilith Hawk rested beside him, a partner in every sense, and Colt knew that the path ahead, though unpredictable, would be navigated together. The first night had tested them both, but it had also revealed the depth of their bond, the strength of their trust, and the promise of a life filled with love, resilience, and shared adventure.